Coming up. This week I've been getting a foreign perspective on post-Brexit Britain. I've been watching the TV channel France 24 this week, and in particular their reportage of the state of the United Kingdom and the impact of Brexit. Where our politicians and media for the most part fear to tread, so the TV channel France 24 report in a detached and refreshingly frank manner. It's pretty hard work for my brain to understand the French TV presenters who speak incredibly quickly in my opinion. Please stay tuned for my explanation of how the French see the crisis unfolding in post-Brexit Britain. If you enjoy watching the Truth to Power channel, I'd really appreciate it if you'd help me out by hitting the like button and especially by sharing a link to this video on your social media platforms. So this is the host of the France 24 news report, Le Monde en tous ses états. The world in all its states. It's a kind of play on words, the world in all its forms, the world in all its countries. And this particular feature-length report was all about the post-Brexit UK. The presenter, Raphael Khan, starts off by saying that the British are currently facing a crisis bigger than anything since the 1970s, that there are almost permanent demonstrations on the streets as prices explode, and that strikes have become the daily lot for many public transport users. Is the United Kingdom on the verge of collapse, he asks.
Le Royaume-Uni au bord de l'effondrement. Pour nous en parler aujourd'hui.
The expert guest on the report is a lady by the name of Sophie Lussoir, who is a professor of British civilization, no less, at the University of Picardy. The first 5 minutes of the report are spent detailing the crisis in the National Health Service as being a crisis of our own Conservative government's own making. But as I covered this particular story in a very recent video, I'm going to skip forward in the interview to the point where Khan introduces roving reporter Ambroise Boulet, who is in London. And he has this to say.
Depuis le Brexit, rien ne va plus au Royaume-Uni.
2 ans après sa sortie effective.
Well, 2 years after its effective exit from the European Union in January 2021, the United Kingdom undoubtedly hoped to be in a much better position.
L'inflation la plus élevée depuis 40 ans et des grèves fait rarissime ici un peu partout.
It has experienced the highest inflation rate in 40 years, and strikes, once rare, are just about everywhere. The leaders in government are trying to blame these difficulties on the back of the global energy crisis and the pandemic that affects almost the entire world. But the United Kingdom seems more affected than other countries. The British economy is collapsing by a greater amount than elsewhere. The growth and development of foreign trade is weaker than for other countries of a similar size.
Difficile donc de ne pas y voir des conséquences du Brexit.
It is therefore difficult not to see the consequences of Brexit, especially since, among all the promises made by Brexitists at the time, many of those promises have failed to materialise.
Beaucoup peinent à se concrétiser. Le Royaume-Uni devait reprendre le contrôle de ses frontières.
One of the promises was that the United Kingdom was going to regain control of its borders.
Eh bien, l'immigration illégale n'a jamais été aussi élevée que l'an dernier.
Illegal immigration hit record levels last year. It has never been higher. The government wanted to develop the economy by freeing companies from the so-called constraints of the European Union.
La paperasserie administrative, perdent des marchés à l'export et peinent à recruter de la main-d'œuvre dans certains secteurs.
Those same companies are now collapsing under administrative paperwork. They're losing their export markets and they're struggling to recruit labour in certain sectors. The Brexiteers' promise was that the country would save the cost of the millions of pounds paid to the EU each year. But now, British farmers, and many others, are completely bollocksed without the financial aid of the Common Agricultural Policy. The best people to talk about it are the British public themselves, and according to the polls, 60% of them now believe that leaving the European Union was a mistake.
D'après les sondages, 60% d'entre eux estiment à présent que quitter l'Union européenne fut une erreur, mais revenir en arrière n'est aujourd'hui pas du tout à l'ordre du jour.
But going back is not at all on the agenda today. When he says that, I think Ambroise Boulet is referring to the state of our two main political parties when he says that going back into the EU is not on the agenda today. But of course that would be equally true from the perspective of the EU. From the EU point of view, you'd imagine they would want to see an entirely new generation of British politicians come along before they would even accept an application for membership. And even though the polls are now showing 2/3 of the British public who express a preference, saying that their preference would be to rejoin the EU, I would imagine that the EU would want to see even that high figure even higher before any application for membership would be considered. The host of Le Monde dans tous ses états then turns to Sophie Luswan, the professor of British civilization, for her comments on the situation. She has a hot take on why post-Brexit Britain is in crisis.
L'inflation a atteint 11% aujourd'hui au Royaume-Uni. Les prix de l'alimentation ont augmenté de 9% à cause du Brexit.
Inflation has reached 11% in the United Kingdom, while food prices have increased by 9%, and it's because of Brexit. Energy prices are higher than in other countries because there is no tariff shield. You do also have inflation in Germany that is quite high, and in the Netherlands as well, but it's ultimately the United Kingdom which today suffers from a triple whammy: a crisis due to Brexit, the pandemic, and obviously the war in Ukraine, which has pushed up energy prices.
Évidemment, la guerre en Ukraine, qui a augmenté les prix de l'énergie. Et le gouvernement a quand même...
The government has put in place an energy price cap until April, but she asks, what will happen after April 2023, bearing in mind that some households already have to choose between heating and eating.
Doivent choisir entre se nourrir et se chauffer. Donc, nous avons une augmentation de la pauvreté.
The increased poverty in the United Kingdom will only get worse. And all this is on top of the crisis of access to healthcare, with the number of cases of COVID and influenza increasing.
Le nombre de cas de Covid et de grippe.
Now, Professor Luswan says what many of her British equivalents would love to say on mainstream media.
Est en hausse. Et souvenez-vous les promesses de Boris Johnson?
And remember the promises of Boris Johnson, who told the British public that they will have £350 million more each week to spend on their National Health Service. Well, contrary to his promises, the British Health Service is in a terrible situation there.
On connaît une situation épouvantable, sans précédent.
Oui, les entreprises notamment, les PME.
The host, Raphael Khan, chimes in at this point, emphasising that small and medium-sized companies have seen their energy bills soar as caps haven't been fully applied for businesses, and the whole British economy has suffered as a result. Back to Professor Luswan.
L'économie britannique souffre énormément.
The British economy is suffering enormously, both families and businesses. And growth is declining. Growth has been reduced by 5.5% since 2016, and above all, investments have fallen by 11%. Although, the British economy still seems resilient. The unemployment rate is at its lowest in 40 years at 3.7%. But, paradoxically, the United Kingdom lacks about 3 million people in various industrial sectors, whether it's health, transport, or hotels and restaurants.
Tous les secteurs, qu'il s'agisse de la santé, des transports et des hôtels, de l'hôtellerie et des restaurants.
Khan picks up on this point about these labour shortages and says that those who are in work, many of them strike when they can, and he also makes the point that many services that are publicly owned in France are privately owned in the UK, the suggestion being that this is perhaps a factor in the terrible industrial relations environment that we now have in the UK. He puts this point to another reporter, Nathan Rama-Harrison, who says,
Le Royaume-Uni, la dernière fois qu'on a eu des mouvements sociaux similaires, c'était dans les années 70. Donc pour vous donner...
These are unprecedented strikes that are currently affecting the United Kingdom. The last time we had anything similar in social movements was back in the 1970s. So to give you a little of the background as to why this is happening. First of all, it's because of an astounding rate of inflation of around 10%, which means less purchasing power for the British and more protests in the streets. You will see this calendar, which is quite impressive. We're only on the first 2 weeks of January, and you see that it is full of strikes forecast in all sectors. Rail or driver's licence examiners, paramedics or teachers, transport, law enforcement or teaching staff, but also, and above all, well, the health community.
Et surtout, eh bien, le milieu de la santé. Regardez les hôpitaux qui ont quand même donné un conseil assez aberrant aux femmes enceintes qui sont sur le point.
Look at the hospitals that have given quite appalling advice to pregnant women who are about to give birth. They must organise their own transport to the hospital, simply because the ambulance services are also partly on strike. And to try to contain all this, the government is trying to pass anti-strike legislation.
Une législation anti-grève qui assurerait un service minimum pour l'ensemble des secteurs que je vous ai cités.
Back to Sophie Luswan, who clearly isn't a fan of Boris Johnson.
Mais il faut rappeler quand même que ces grèves remontent à l'été du mécontentement, alors que Boris Johnson était encore Premier ministre.
But it must still be remembered that these strikes date back to the summer of discontent, when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister and did nothing. He went on vacation and did not deal with this issue of strikes. OK, that was the first half of the report. In the second half, they really come into focus more on Brexit, so stay with me. The host, Raphael Khan, talks about what he calls the ravages caused by the crisis in the United Kingdom, a country that is now facing its difficulties all alone.
Un pays qui fait face désormais seul à ses difficultés, pas question d'une quelconque aide européenne.
There is no question of any European aid since London broke the moorings in 2020. For 3 years now, the British have been sailing solo. Khan introduces a report from the most Brexit voting town in Britain, Boston in Lincolnshire.
Cette ville est celle qui a le plus voté pour le Brexit. Mais ici, le rejet de l'Europe est avant tout celui de l'immigration.
Here, the rejection of Europe is above all about immigration, according to the mayor here, Danny. With Brexit, there is not much that changes in real life because we always have foreigners arriving. I want to tell you something. There are people from Kazakhstan who are working on farms right now. They are not from the European Union, but they work and are brought with only 6-month visas.
Il y a toujours des nouvelles personnes, hein. C'est ça la diversité.
Conseiller régional pour le Lincolnshire et propriétaire.
Danny is also a regional councillor for Lincolnshire and also the owner of the local Café de Paris. And he considers that newcomers must integrate better. Most of them watch their own TV channels from Polish, Latvian and Lithuanian channels. They are going shopping in their own stores. They don't come to town. And that's the fault of the government that didn't spend anything to integrate them. Well, if you bring in people who don't speak English, if you don't teach them English, nor the law, nor the values of the country, they just come to work. And I would say that's the English mentality. We tell them we are the upper nation, we have the money, and you work for us, and we don't care if you speak English. Integration is very important. In the decade before the referendum, the number of foreigners settling in Boston increased fourfold. Back to the studio, and Professor Luswan is asked if post-Brexit Britain does actually control its borders now. No, she says, they don't control them any better than before. As expected, dreams of sovereignty have flown away.
Et donc, le Brexit a eu un effet négatif à la fois.
Brexit has had a negative effect on both immigration and on the British economy, which is now suffering from the lack of trade. British exports have fallen. No trade agreement has been reached with the United States. Business investment has reduced by 11%, and since 2016, growth has fallen by 5.5%.
La croissance a chuté de 5,5%. Donc...
Back to Nathan Ramaherison.
Les conséquences économiques du Brexit, elles sont assez catastrophiques pour le Royaume-Uni, tout simplement.
The economic consequences of Brexit are quite catastrophic for the United Kingdom. One simple fact is that the United Kingdom's already paid £33 billion as a severance payment to the European Union. This is a fairly substantial figure, especially if it is added to the fall in the country's gross domestic product, which always indicates a nation's economic health. GDP is 5.5% lower in the second quarter of 2022 than what it would have been if the United Kingdom had remained in the European Union. It has now stabilised at around 5% difference, but it obviously remains a fairly significant gap. And then another figure that is quite striking is that business investment is in free fall too, an 11% loss for London, which equates to about £12 billion. Back to Monsieur Khan. These figures twist the knife for British people who did not want this Brexit. So we can better understand, seeing these figures, why many Britons today regret Brexit, to the point where a new word has appeared in the English language. Regret.
Beaucoup de Britanniques aujourd'hui regrettent le Brexit à tel point même qu'un mot apparaît dans le langage. Regret.
According to the polls, a British majority would now reject the exit from the European Union. And then Sophie Luswan adds,
60% des Britanniques estiment que le Brexit est une erreur.
60% of Britons believe that Brexit is a mistake. 70% of Britons want a closer relationship with the European Union. And 25% of British would like to join the European Union. But there is no question of it. Even Keir Starmer, who voted to remain in the European Union, does not want to organise a new referendum on the United Kingdom's membership of the EU. And we will probably have to wait a generation, that is 20 years, before the United Kingdom eventually returns to the European Union. But in any case, it created a feeling of disillusionment among the public for a political class that manipulated opinion to achieve a Brexit vote. And remember as well that the gap between Brexit supporters and supporters of remaining was very close, and these geographical and sociological disparities are still felt. Today, the UK is a disunited kingdom, divided between the Scots, the Northern Irish and the Londoners, who all voted to remain in the European Union, and a rural England and Wales that voted for Brexit.
Aujourd'hui, nous avons un pays divisé entre les Écossais, les Irlandais du Nord, les Londoniens, qui ont voté pour le maintien dans l'Union européenne, et une Angleterre rurale et un Pays de Galles qui ont voté pour le Brexit.
Raphael Kahn then hands over to their Brussels correspondent, Alex Le Bourdon, who says this.
Cet impact négatif du Brexit sur l'économie britannique, beaucoup l'avaient prédit ici à Bruxelles et il est confirmé aujourd'hui par les chiffres avec...
Many here in Brussels predicted this negative impact of Brexit on the British economy, and it is confirmed today by the figures. For example, with this 30% drop in exports of British products to the European Union in 2021. But here, in the corridors of power in Brussels, we're careful not to have any vengeful comments, since the priority now is first of all to find a solution to the issues surrounding the Northern Ireland Protocol, a provision provided for in the Brexit agreement which the United Kingdom has threatened to unilaterally tear up.
Brexit sur laquelle le Royaume-Uni menaçait de revenir de manière unilatérale. Alors...
Some final words from the hugely informed Professor Luswam.
Les Britanniques ont respecté la souveraineté populaire.
The British used to respect the sovereignty it used to have. Remember, the majority of British MEPs were in favour of keeping the UK in the European Union. This was an outcome given to us by British democracy, which was listening to its population. But then along came the Brexit campaign with all its lies and poison.
Alors ensuite, la campagne sur le Brexit a été mensongère et venimeuse. C'est un autre problème.
That caused a new problem. Today, the UK must try to manage the situation, avoid violence in Northern Ireland, respect the Good Friday 1998 agreements that restored peace in Northern Ireland, and then also maintain the unity of the United Kingdom and avoid any desire of Northern Ireland to join the Irish Republic, which would lead to a weakening of the United Kingdom.
Ce qui conduirait à un affaiblissement du Royaume-Uni.
Ouais, il y a l'Irlande du Nord et puis il y en a d'autres que la situation inquiète au plus haut point, ce sont les Écossais.
Raphael Kahn then points out it's not just Northern Ireland, but even more so Scotland, which had a vast majority in favour of remaining in the European Union in the Brexit referendum. They experienced it, he says, as a heartbreak at the time, to the extent where it has put IndyRef 2, a new independence referendum, back at the forefront of the Scottish people's vision.
Les conservateurs sont menacés en Écosse, on voit alors surgir ce mouvement pour l'indépendance qui ne fera que grossir par la suite.
In Scotland, the emergence of this movement for independence will only grow in the future. Scotland's castles have withstood bad weather and cold winds for centuries. A new storm crosses the country with a nationalist slingshot. 40% of Scots want to cut bridges with London.
Le Parti nationaliste écossais veut l'indépendance de l'Écosse.
The Scottish National Party wants Scotland's independence and a place in the European community.
Pendant des années, Londres nous a dit ce que nous devions faire.
For years, London told us what to do. Now it's up to us to decide.
Il y a une certaine frustration économique qui a aussi renforcé le sentiment nationaliste.
And there is a certain economic frustration that has also strengthened the nationalist sentiment. So this video has been a little bit longer than usual, so I'm going to stop it there. But I'll put the link to the original video from France 24 in the comments below if you want to see the full 25-minute original report in French. I hope you enjoyed this insight into Brexit from a French perspective.